All right, so hello and welcome again to our third lecture in the Labs for Liberation Summer Institute lecture series. My name is Angela Stanley, and I am the accessibility coordinator for the Summer Institute. I am a brown-skinned Black woman with Black hair pulled into a high pony or a bun. I'm wearing a red shirt under blue denim overalls. I'm also wearing glasses with Black over the ear headphones. We're happy to have you all with us today, but before we get started, I wanted to go over some housekeeping details. So we do have cart captioning as well as ASL interpretation. For those who would like to engage with the captions in a separate window or a separate screen if you have it, I have just added the link in the chat. So this will take you to a separate window where you can change the color, size, and font that the captions are presented to you. Our ASL interpreters are currently pinned to the center of your screen. To ensure you see the interpreters, please change your view to side-by-side gallery. These options will change as speakers share their screen or stop sharing their screen. And as mentioned in our communications, we have enabled the Q&A function for this webinar to allow you to ask any questions that you might have. We will be having a dedicated question and answer period following the two presentations and after a brief 5-minute break. This meeting will be 2 hours long, so please stretch, move, or otherwise listen to your body's needs as to be able to engage fully. The other way that we ask you to engage with the lecture and each other is by using our Discord channel. I'm going to add a link for Discord in the chat, but just be aware that that your request to join our Discord channel may be accepted towards the end or at the end of this meeting. We will have folks monitoring the channels to ensure that folks are able to comfortably engage in the space. For today's event, myself and Walker Brewer will be your access doulas. So please reach out to us if there are any access issues. Our lab leaders will also be in those spaces if you have other questions. As a reminder, this and all future lectures will be recorded. For accessibility and privacy reasons, we ask that any screenshots, notes, or other materials that you record be only used for your personal and educational purposes. In seeking to build a consent-based community, we ask that you seek and gain consent from our speakers, lecturers, etc., before sharing any work. To model this, we have permission from our speakers to share recordings of these lectures with our Summer Institute participants, including study buddies. If these lectures later become available to the wider community, we will post about this on social media or send out an email. So with this in mind, and without further ado, I will pass it over to our Institute directors, Amy Hendren and Moya Bailey, as well as our moderator, LJ Jaffe.
Thank you, Angela. My name is Amy Hamrai. I'm an olive-skinned Iranian transmasculine person with short, dark, curly hair and glasses. I'm wearing a black t-shirt. On behalf of the Labs for Liberation team, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you to our lecture series on disability and design. If you've been following our lecture series each week, you know that we are highlighting key concepts and approaches in the critical study of access, combining scholarship from Black feminist disability studies, crypt technoscience, and disability justice activism. Today's lectures will focus on the concepts of access washing and access friction. Access friction points to the messy and sometimes uncomfortable moments that arise from inaccessibility, competing access needs, or the incompatibility of a person with a designed environment. Access friction can also be productive and generative, and not just a conflict that shuts down politics. Access washing refers to practices or policies that are carried out in the name of accessibility, but that ultimately undermine the goals of disability justice. Today's event is part of a conversation that has been unfolding for nearly a century. In some ways, the concepts of access friction and access washing have been the most discussed and debated around the critical study of access. And I write about this in my book, Building Access, and also discussed it in the first lecture in the series, that these concepts have actually been central to debates about access since the 1950s and 60s, which is to say that disabled people have not always taken access for granted as something that is automatically good, but have really questioned what are the meanings of access, who is it for, and what is it trying to do. Physical access frictions are also sometimes used intentionally in design, as in the case of tactile paving on curb cuts. And friction is a practice that many disabled thinkers and writers and designers use to critique the built environment. And these concepts have eventually made it into different forms of activism and protest, and cross-disability organizing. More recently, in the last 15 to 20 years, the concepts of access washing and access friction have been especially important for the perspectives of disabled feminists of color, particularly Black and AAPI disability activists, who have explained the distinctions between white and liberal disability narratives and the promises and perils of access, that are like for those goals. And in particular, the late disability justice activist Stacey Park Milburn wrote about the concept of access washing in her notes on how compliance with legal accessibility codes sometimes gets used to harm the most marginalized disabled people, including people who are unhoused or who are disabled by war and displacement. So we're really excited to continue this century-long conversation and to get Amani and Sarah's takes on these concepts as part of this broader lineage of thinking. And I want to also give a shout out to Sarah for supporting the early dreaming of this Summer Institute almost a decade ago. And we're really excited to have LJ Jaffe as our moderator, who is writing a book about access washing now. And so now I'll turn it over to Moya.
Hello, everyone. My name is Moya Bailey. I'm a dark-skinned Black woman with a short fro, with glasses, and I'm wearing a shirt that says the love building, trying to bring just a little love into this moment that we are all in. I am joining you all, and we are recording this webinar via digital devices that are linked all over Turtle Island. I live in the traditional unceded homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, though many other tribes also called this area home. We are in a global community with many of you in spaces where the traditional stewards of the land have been displaced. We recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. I was moved by a conversation with Indigenous elders in which they said land acknowledgements can make people feel like they can relax. We do not want to help white supremacy relax. And when it comes to our turn to the digital, it can be easy to forget that the hardware that connects us is made from materials extracted from stolen land and mined by exploited people around the world. When discussing our work and its social justice implications, we cannot forget the too often invisibilized logics of settler colonialism and the land, labor, and love that makes this lecture series possible. In addition to acknowledging the land that supports this Global Labs for Liberation project, we work to make sure our work supports the descendants of those whose enslaved labor made this space possible. We acknowledge the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who've enriched this region of the world with cultural and economic contributions that can never truly be quantified. May we add to this remembrance and acknowledgement of the Congolese miners who mine the minerals that power our digital devices, and the Zhengzhou Foxconn factory workers that make many of these devices. The exploited labor of people around the planet is supplemented by the love that went into making this event possible. Many thanks to Amy, Angela, LJ, Walker, and other members of the Labs for Liberation team that are making this moment possible. We also want to thank the Mellon Foundation and our respective institutions for helping to make today possible. But thank you for being here, and thank you to the ancestors, scholars, activists, organizers that loved each other to make the world a little bit more possible with disability justice. In an ongoing pandemic, amidst genocides, wars, earthquakes, thinking of Sudan, Iran, and ecological devastation around the globe, it can be overwhelming to think about doing business as usual. But let's use our time together as a little pocket of possibility, a buoyant bubble in a world on fire. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Amy again.
Thank you, Moya. So please note that this is a webinar. You can submit your questions through the Q&A function. The chat will not take place here for accessibility reasons. And if you are registered for the event, you should be able to have a link to the Discord server, which I think Angela also just shared. And so please click on the link for the week 3 lecture chat when you get into the server. And I'll pass it over to Moya to talk about our code of conduct.
So I wanted to also let people know we'll be taking a break at 11:05 Central Time. So just so that people know, we do have a scheduled break in addition to folks taking the time they need to take care of themselves. Labs for Liberation is committed to promoting a considerate and respectful environment focused on collaboration, accessibility, communication, curiosity, and generosity. We are dedicated to creating a consent-based anti-harassment culture rooted in principles of disability justice. For the longer version of the Code of Conduct, you can see a link to this in the chat. And now I'm going to turn it over to LJ, who will be moderating our time today.
Hello and good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are joining from. This is LJ Jaffe speaking. I'm a white woman with dark brown hair tied up in a messy top bun, and I'm currently wearing blue headphones. Thank you all for being here. I am really excited about today's speakers, and I'm sure you all are as well. As a reminder, all lecture materials should only be used within the Institute, and we ask that you not share any recordings without consent from the speakers. We'll hear from Sara Hendren. Sara is an artist, design researcher, professor, and writer. She is the author of What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. She is also an associate professor of art and design, as well as architecture at Northeastern University. Sara's talk is titled 15 Years of the Accessible Icon Project, Looking Back. Her talk will look at the evolution of the Accessible Icon Project, which offered a variation on the international symbol of access. Sara will reflect on the project's legacy and mixed reception, asking questions about the affordances of practical design, social practice art, access washing, and mass communication. A reminder to please share your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. But first, we will hear from Sara Hendren.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much, Imani, for that talk. I wrote down a lot of connections here. My name is Sara Hendren, and I'm a middle-aged white woman with dark brown and kind of graying shoulder-length hair, and sitting in a friend's cabin in upstate New York. It's going to be a scorcher today. I want to share some images from the Accessible Icon Project, as I told you, so I'm going to do that now. And I look forward to our discussion. So, LJ, I'm hoping you can just thumbs up or voice that you are seeing the blue and white international symbol of access designed by Suzanne Kofod. Thank you. So I want to talk today about this work of infrastructural design.
Yes, we are seeing it.
Wonderful.
This is Moya.
Thank you, Moya. So this is Sarah again. So I want to talk today about this work of what I would call infrastructural design, that is the international symbol of access. And I've got an image of it here, the blue and white image of a stick figure in a wheelchair designed in the 1960s by Suzanne Kofod, and a profound idea in the built environment. That is to say, the guarantee that parking spaces, doors, and so on would be marked and set aside to make access more possible in the built environment. And I want to talk today about the Accessible Icon project that reworked it, the reactions to it, this matter of access washing, and then a larger meditation, especially for you designers on the call, on the matter of representation itself, the affordances of design versus art, I think getting clear about that, and the opportunities for both critique and repair in the dispositions of what we make. So I'm just listing here in bullet form the kind of topics that I want to visit. I want to talk first about precedents in what's called interrogative design, and then give it the briefest possible overview of the icon project. I'm happy to talk more about it. It's 15 years old now, so happy to talk more about it if you want to know, but I'm going to shorten that in order to make room for, criticism, this question of representation and its discontents, and then knowing your post as a person who might make design, of critique and repair. So, and all of it is to visit this, again, especially this moment in the icon project, and I've got an image of it here, which is the first iteration, a clear backed sticker of a red and orange figure using a wheelchair. That's sort of the italicized version, let's say, of the blue and white symbol underneath it. And it's so the clear backed sticker is superimposed over the old one. And this was this kind of first iteration and moment. Okay, but to set the precedent, when I was working on these ideas, back in the late 2000s, and I mean, before 2010 is the real start of this project, but prior to that, I was a young mother of first a son named Graham, who has Down syndrome. He's now 19 years old, but we were in the midst of, he was the first of my three children, and we were in the midst of physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. And I had three children pretty close together. So I was deep in a kind of life stage of interdependence and also waking up to disability matters for the first time in lots of ways. And then also thinking about my own future. My training had been up to that point in fine arts and visual culture, but also in intellectual history. And I went looking for the kind of forms of fine arts that would sort of do justice to both expressive and pragmatic concerns that at the time I didn't have a lot of words for, but that I felt at attention in disability, just sort of in everyday life, and watching Graham do life, the way people spoke about him and at him and so on. So this is an image of Natalie Jeremijenko's, couple of images here from her Ag Bags project. So this is a series of white bags that are hangable over like a city balcony. So the image on the left has that done. It's like hanging over the kind of top railing of a building in the city in New York, or they could hang over just a regular old balcony on an apartment building. And they house little pollinator gardens because they're full of dirt. And the thing about this is that they're white and they've got this red X on them. And Jeremijenko was making this project, among many others, in what she called an environmental health clinic. So the red and white there does this associational work with the clinic and the medical on behalf of kind of climate emergency. So what's happening here is that there's both a practical provision, like what are all the cement spaces that could suddenly make new room for green spaces, but then also pointing to the difficulty of a kind of macro meta-crisis issue that is climate. So it both makes a kind of intervention that's useful, but it holds open by this quality of enigma. We're just seeing the repeated white, bags and the red X, and we're not really sure. You have to dig to find out what's going on here, and it's presented as art. That it holds open that kind of question without resolve. And to me, this is a kind of achievement between art, design, and engineering that I'll talk a little bit about later. Secondly, I was watching the work of Krzysztof Wodiczko, who's a He's now in his 80s. He's been a longtime artist, trained in Poland in the post-war era in industrial design, but his work has been presented as art in the kind of practical sense. And he is the one who coined this term interrogative design, so design that asks a question. And I went on to study with him after my three kids were born because I just admired this work so much, the achievement of it. I've got two images here of what's called the Homeless Vehicle Project. So it was a co-designed project of a kind of portable mode of housing, again, in New York. So on the right side, there's a photograph of a man pushing this metal contraption that has inside it a sleeping chamber. But below that is the kind of storage area, and it's on wheels, and it's got a flag for visibility. So it is a kind of mobile home that could traverse the built environment, in this case in New York. And on the left, I've got a kind of industrial design style schema of Vodichko's project showing its various uses. So during the day, it could have a metal basin or a barbecue with this nose that folds down. And then again at night, it has this sleeping chamber. But what Vodichko would say is that this is not meant to be this like, oh, one weird trick, that scales to manufacture to quote, solve a problem. No, not at all. He would call this interrogative design, which is to say that you provide a kind of, even a band-aid, which we tend to speak about in derogative terms, that a band-aid on a kind of issue that then actually holds open the issue unresolved and in fact unignorable in public. So the enigma quality of a practical object also has this way of being in your face about the unacceptability, of course, at scale, of a very wealthy country in which people can't find housing. It's letting both of those things live in a kind of contestation without sacrificing each. Right, what Vodichko would say, I think, and I am persuaded by this, that the gallery is a space of critique that we can hold open for examining in the kind of contemplative style social issues. But interrogative design has this other move in its kind of wheelhouse, which is to say it provides something quite pragmatic, load-bearing, practical, engineered even, while also kind of having that foot in the gallery. And this is a very difficult condition to achieve. And I was so inspired by this kind of this achievement of that question. So not in the space of disability at that time, but thinking, how can art do ideas in a way that has this valence and this real kind of traction of use value? So again, in addition to interrogative design, Vodichko coined this term for what he does. He would call it scandalous functionalism. And this to me is a very vivid phrase, that the things that he makes do function. They are not proposals and they are not renderings in that speculative sense. So they do work, they obey those kind of laws of physics and mechanical engineering, but they pack their scandal in them like a big neon sign that is drawing the circle again around the issue that it is trying to address. So it openly does that band-aiding work while making this unignorable enigma in public. So those kind of projects were in my mind. I had quotes by Jeremijenko and Vodichko, on my desk when my kids were little, thinking, how can I, not really fully conscious at the time, but thinking, watching all of the kind of mixed reception that Graham would get in public and think, what would do justice to a world that's inaccessible, but also to ideas about disability that are just rife with cliches and sentimentality, the need for practical access and also making ideas and meaning about one another. So finally, then this was a kind of big opening moment for me to discover Wendy Jacobs' partnership with Temple Grandin on the squeeze chair. Jacob at that time was also at MIT, where Vodichko was and spent so many decades. So Grandin's squeeze chair that she designed for herself, she's an engineer in animal husbandry, autistic self-advocate. And so on the left is an image of her deep pressure machine that she crawls in at the end of the day and gives her this enormously reassuring kind of proxy for human touch. That was written about quite famously by Oliver Sacks in The New Yorker, and Wendy saw that and reached out to Grandin to partner on the squeeze chair. So there's an image on the right of the squeeze chairs, which look like kind of big club chairs and the kind of big upholstered square chunky version, but they reach up around you when activated by a foot pedal and give you a giant hug in this kind of like deep pressure way. And Wendy's chairs are presented in galleries as art and also have been tested as practical objects. But to me, the kind of the twinning of this idea, both Grandin's insight and her own self-engineering and that design that's sort of held up in this very particular way for her, and then Jacobs sort of taking the poetics of that idea of the squeeze chair. In other words, what if the world had in it furniture replete with kind of emotional intimacy or perhaps therapeutic ends, but not necessarily the kind of indeterminacy of that, the holding up of a question, the interrogative, for me is what was a kind of aha moment, a kind of light bulb. So I'm very interested in what Alfredo Jar talks about achieving is this kind of deep amalgamation, this alloy between use and poetics. It's a lot harder than it looks, let me tell you. So into that, I mean, I began this project, and I've got an image here of a blog that I ran for a long time in the 2000s called Abler. And I just you see in here it's March of 2010. I just noted here the difference between a couple of different iterations of the International Symbol of Access. One on the top that is that traditional one of COFIDs from the 60s. And the one that I saw at MoMA, just happened to see that has more rounded edges, kind of organic lines for the figure, and just takes away that kind of rectilinear quality and has this arm extended out in the back. And I thought this is interesting, just the visual language of what's going on here. And then I started to notice those differentiated images at other places in the built environment. So this is an image of the door at Marshall's in Cambridge, Mass, where I live, that's got this blue and white figure, but again has these rounded edges to the neck and the end of the hand and the foot, and then it's got these two motion lines behind the wheel that's showing a kind of symbolic motion. And I thought, again, this is just interesting to think about from a visual culture perspective. What's going on here? It's before we did anything. And then I started looking at the way that 2D isotype images function in the built environment. So I've got an image here on the left of activities you can do at let's say at a national park. And there's no language about instructing you what to do, but just in blue and white 2D images, it's showing you a figure that's swimming, a figure that's boating, etc., skiing. And in fact, the kind of dynamism in the image on the right of a stick figure that is exiting a building. So showing you in very clear terms, you don't have to speak the language to look up and know, how do I get out of this movie theater? Okay, there is this figure showing me. So what about this profound provision of the International Symbol of Access in the light of what could be done in terms of that dynamism? So I've got an image here of the early kind of graffiti forms, like messing around with stickers, where there's a sticker kind of superimposed on a sign. And then it became this image that I've described before, this first superimposed clear back sticker with a red and orange icon around it, on top of it. This project got some press as a kind of guerrilla street art project, and people took it up and were interested in it, and then asked us to create a more permanent shareable image for the moments when their parking stickers were running out or their signs were kind of getting old or whatever. So I've got an image here of like going to the table with a bunch of stakeholders, figuring out like what would this new graphic be like. And I've got the proposed accessible icon. This was Tim Ferguson-Souders' work, who worked with Brian Glennie and myself on these to bring this kind of new icon into line with the standardization of what we expect for the infrastructure of isotypes and pictograms, the kind of bathroom signs and so on. And so here it is. I've got this image of that you may know that is the kind of reworked permanent symbol that is in the public domain. It's not we've never made a fee for this outside of museum exhibitions like this year. But it is downloadable and in use for free in the public, and has gone out as this symbol that people use, again, when they're trying to replace their signs and so on. So the aftermath of that project was people reaching out to us. Like I've got an image here of an accessible parking sign in India. A doctor wrote to me and said, I see what you're doing, like I just want to show you our shared commitments. So we've got this blue and white, parking sign with our image on it. And then this was not our idea, but nonprofits would hold social events like this. So this is a number of people in a parking lot who've got a big stencil to paint over. a faded sign on the asphalt. So a number of people doing that together and using that as a kind of moment to connect, to talk about access in the built environment and so on. There's another image of that, just a row of these stenciled images and a woman who's a wheelchair user holding that stencil. You can see it sometimes in museum environments. I've got the museum installation shown here from the Cooper Hewitt and on New York City taxi cabs and so on. And then, perhaps my favorite is just the way that people use it, even who don't use wheelchairs, and I'll get to that in a minute, who use it as a kind of launching pad to lobby in their communities for transportation, education, and so on. So this is Brendan Hildreth, who lives in North Carolina, who uses it as a kind of opening, sharp end of the wedge to talk about material kind of concerns. So again, this is the kind of beating heart of the project, I would say, and then what it kind of became. Okay, so let me get to the sort of criticism and limits of representation. Lots of people who didn't like the project had multiple grounds on which they find it objectionable. There's a kind of like, this is a super cripping exercise where we're valorizing perhaps the manual wheelchair or the kind of wheelchair athlete, as though, in other words, that icon makes a kind of idolatry out of the overcoming the body and so on. So that's certainly one way that people read it symbolically. Lots of people have said it's not universal. Like, why should a kind of universal standardization symbol be made of wheelchair use, which of course doesn't even remotely account for all the disability in the world? Lots of people who said this is access washing. It makes it so easy for companies and others to adopt a sign and a symbol and then fail to back it up with money, legal, policy, right, all kinds of stuff. And then people object, of course, on my positionality as a non-disabled person working in partnership. I mean, we can talk about that last one in the Q&A if you want to. But I'll just name some of these others that I think have a little more to discuss. We saw in the wake of the project, design kind of competitions and forums devoted to like, well, let's take apart this idea in general. Let's not assume a wheelchair. Let's do some redesign. Full stops. On the left is an image of a blue and white circle that's got a kind of open door image, and this is one of the I think honorable mentions. There was not a winner for this contest, but were run by an MP in Canada, a student contest of sort of like, what would more symbolically represent everything that access is supposed to stand for. So they did not, again, pick a winner, but this was one of the ones that people thought were really successful. I've got on the right an image of a number of triangles that have other proposals in them, like a spoon for chronic illness community, the infinity symbol horizontally for neurodivergence and so on. So plenty of people, and we can talk about this, have proposed other kinds of ideas for revisiting the virtues of this standardization. It's interesting to think about these questions in tandem with what we've seen, the growth in emojis for representation. So I've got images here from Apple's set of emojis. There are more since 2018 when these came out. So a person in a motorized chair, a person in a manual chair, a person using a cane. So in other words, we ask design in some ways to do the work of one-to-one representation. We want to see ourselves. I would argue that that's a little bit at odds with the virtues of standardization, which do have a kind of trade-off, and that they don't do this one-to-one recognition work, but they do a kind of maximizing of utility in the sense that they go out internationally. I can get on a plane today and fly somewhere where I don't speak the language and spot easily, because of the line weights and so on, an image that I know from my own home country about where the elevators are and so on. We could debate this, right? There's lots of ways to think about it, but I do think being specific about what standardization makes possible, what the kind of mid-scale of the emoji makes possible, what fine art makes possible. So I've got an image here of Alison Lapper pregnant. This is Mark Quinn's famous sculpture from 10 or 15 years ago. If you know the Fourth Plinth program, then you know that Trafalgar Square in London, I've got an image of it here on the right, has these kind of famous heroic male figures on these three plinths in this big, kind of celebratory public plaza, and that the fourth plinth is devoted to a rotating cast of other artworks, public artworks, that can kind of be in conversation. So Alison Lapper here who has very atypical body with foreshortened limbs and is pregnant here, depicted in stone like the kind of classical Greek sculptures, but without that kind of idealization of the male body, the male non-disabled body, is in conversation in this fine art way with that tradition of the fourth plinth. And I think it is really interesting that it's doing this in the form of what art makes possible, a highly specific form of portraiture that then is elevated to be in conversation with this grand story and to interrupt it and to complicate it. But those things are really quite different, it seems to me. So I would argue for designers that you might just try to get clearer on whether your value, and these are just, it seems to me, different projects that are morally neutral. But if you're interested in standardization, you will have to foreclose some of the specificity in the favor of reducing cognitive load by recognizability, across scales. If you are interested in the expressive gesture, absolutely. I would always argue that we want design to do stuff that art is really meant to do, because we're more suspicious of art as kind of elitist and so on. So it gets a little bit of short shrift. I think the art gesture is doing so much storytelling and idiosyncrasy and specificity, and we should let it do that job. You might also just ask yourself where between use and poetics you want your work to live, where use value kind of ends on standardization and poetics on the artistic gesture. A third way to put it, perhaps you are interested in coming to design from the engineering standpoint, that's on the far left of the slide, where that use value and the pragmatics are really important. You might, on the other hand, like me, come at it from the art kind of end of design and be interested in the enigma, the interrogative, the kind of like frictionful, unresolved. But design, I've got that in the middle here, is this big blurry house that lists between those two different poles, and it can hug very closely the needs and the trade-offs of engineering, or it can hug very closely that kind of gallery gesture and all of its strangeness. So again, use and poetics between engineering and art typically. And the last thing I'll just say is that you might just, as a young designer, ask yourself, or an aspiring designer of any age, whether your work is more animated by a kind of disposition of critique. And I would argue that whatever you think about the Icon project, that early iteration had a little bit more of that critique in it, because it wasn't actually super legible. It did this kind of interruption. It created some kind of cognitive friction there. And that the latter form of the project, at people's request for it, became more in the reparative mode, in the sense that it provided a free, multiply replicable image for use in the public domain. So it did that kind of pragmatic work, which has the trade-off of it is that it does this smoothness of access washing, right? It absolutely allows, the taxi environment, the multinational corporation to take up a sign that is merely a sign. And I guess, as a person who makes things all the time, I don't have the luxury of being just armchair critic. I mean, I'm for critique. I do some critical writing and so on. But I want to just say that between the seminar, which is the world of art and the world of critique, and the world of the studio, on the other hand, the kind of use and repair and the design studio, those are actually two very different mindsets that you have to see anything come to light. So I'm saying to you, I made a thing. Plenty of people enjoyed it. Plenty of people actually had big objections to it. It's actually no universal widget is out there in the world, pluggable in with every potential access anticipation. So I want the designers in the room here to feel enfranchised, not to do a perfect and comprehensive kind of design, but to do a design that is clear-eyed about its trade-offs and about what its animus and questions really are. So I'll leave it there, and thanks for your attention. We'll look forward to the Q&A.